After the 9/11 attacks, artistic and especially musical responses were immediate and powerful, ranging from informal gatherings to sing patriotic songs to music of remembrance, hope, and anger from all genres. John Adams on the Transmigration of Souls was co-commissioned in 2002 by the New York Philharmonic and Lincoln Center's great performers to commemorate the first anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks. It was first performed on September 19, 2002 at Avery Fisher Hall in New York City by the New York Philharmonic, New York Choral Artists, and the Brooklyn Youth Chorus. It was the opening work of the orchestra's 2002-2003 season. Adams won a Pulitzer Prize for the memorial piece in 2003, and the New York Philharmonic's recording won 3 Grammy Awards in 2004. Adams said the following when asked about his decision to accept the commission, quote, "I knew that the labor and the immersion that would be required of me would help answer questions and uncertainties about my own feelings about the event. I was probably no different from most Americans in not knowing how to cope with the enormous complexity suddenly thrust upon us. Being given the opportunity to make a work of art that would speak directly to people's emotions allowed me not only to come to grips personally with all that had happened, but also gave me a chance to give something to others." The text comes from the Portraits of Grief series, which ran in the New York Times after 9/11, memorializing the victims, missing persons posters from around Ground Zero in the days following the attacks, the last words of the flight attendant on American Airlines Flight Number 11, and select names from the list of victims. It scored for SATB chorus, children's chorus, orchestra, a quarter-tone piano, and quarter-tone string ensemble, both tuned a quarter step higher than the rest of the instruments, and pre-recorded sounds. John Adams, born 1947, is a living American composer who is rooted in minimalism, and sometimes called post-minimalist. The overarching view of minimalism often includes a belief that it is somewhat apolitical, allowing room for the audience to decide on interpretation, which is part of the reason Adams was chosen for a commission for such a political piece. While he does use some characteristics of the movement, such as repetition of names and the word missing, static harmonies and repeated melodic patterns in the choral writing, which create a, quote, aesthetic of emptiness, end quote, he also uses some non-minimalist qualities, like climaxes and development. These ideas are manifested on the Transmigration of Souls, and I'll discuss the specifics of this later in the video. Adams also uses the technique of musique concrète, which is the use of pre-recorded natural environmental sounds like the cityscape, sirens, and footsteps. When asked to create a memorial of any kind, an artist takes on a very difficult task. Grief is an incredibly personal process, and all people affected by the tragedy in question will react to and deal with loss differently. As a result of these widely varying emotions and opinions, it's nearly impossible to craft a memorial which all survivors will deem appropriate. John Adams and many other creators of memorials, such as the architect who designed the Vietnam War Memorial, dealt with this challenge by attempting to create what Adams called a memory space, or a place where mourners could contemplate events and memorialize loved ones in their own way, as disconnected as possible from politics as well as divisions on the basis of faith, race, and gender. Adams explains that his desire in writing this piece was to achieve in a musical way the feeling of being in the presence of many souls, while still feeling alone with your thoughts and emotions in a spiritual way. He explains his hope for the work to transcend commemorating 9/11 alone when he says, quote, "I hope that the piece will summon human experience that goes beyond this particular event. Transmigration means the movement from one place to another. In this case, I mean it to imply the movement of the soul from one state to another. And I don't just mean the transition from living to dead, but also the change that takes place within the souls of those that stay behind, of those that suffer pain and loss and themselves come away from the experience transformed." The work begins with a recording of a cityscape, with the sounds of a typical day in New York City, footsteps, chatter, sirens, and cars, and soon after the audience is transported outside to this typical day, a young boy's voice begins speaking the word, missing. This minimalist repetition was John Adams' way of asserting that the absence is both permanent and significant. Adams explained that he thought it was important to highlight absence, incompleteness, and loss in his memorial, while allowing space for audiences to collaborate in their remembrance. It's a haunting and poignant beginning, as the harps, chorus, and strings help to create what seems like a suspension of time and space. It's a disorienting and confusing beginning, which Adams says reflects the feelings of grief as much as they reflect the chaos of that morning.
Missing. 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 Missing.
John Flory. Christina Flannery.
Missing.
John Flory.
There is unbelievable artistry in Adams' setting of the beginning of the choral writing. The first text sung by the choir is "Remember," but they first say "remem" over and over, both underscoring the difficulty of rehashing the memories, and simultaneously acknowledging the importance of doing so.
Lieutenant Stephen J. Missing. Guy Bartsby.
Guy Barsby.
Missing. Missing. Bartsby.
Guy Barsby.
Missing. Guy Miss Bartsby.
Guy Barsby.
Missing. Guy Bartsby.
Guy Barsby.
Guy Bartsby.
Guy Barsby.
Guy Bartsby.
There are quite a few other sections of the score which highlight the difficulty for survivors of remembering their loved ones, since it brings back the awful memories of that day. For example, page 11 of the score features a hocket between the children's and SATB choir of the words, "You will never be forgotten." In this way, it almost sounds like they are helping each other to get the words out, and the chromatically descending lines in the quarter tone ensemble and celesta parts that follow it suggest someone forgetting the memories, implying the complexity of emotions behind memorializing the victims. Adams' use of the phrase, "She looks so full of life in that picture," referring to the missing persons posters placed around Ground Zero in the days after the attack, also shows a distancing from emotion, as the choir sings on short staccato notes. After the choir begins singing, "She looks so full of life in that picture," with a quarter rest in between each eighth note, the distance between each note begins to augment, until the words are an entire measure apart. This choice also contributes to the feeling of creating a distance from reality, as well as seeming to imitate the slowing of a heartbeat. This section ends with a transition into the first reference to the last words of American Airlines Flight Number 11's flight attendant, "I see water and buildings," which can barely be heard in the children's choir, followed by a tribute to the Windows on the World restaurant. One of the most noticeable motives in the piece is the one just played in the bassoon and flutes. It's a two-note repeated pattern of do-me, and while it's first introduced in the orchestra, it returns countless times throughout the work, most often in reference to a specific relationship to the dead, such as brother or mother. The children's choir uses the motive much more often than the SATB choir, which also makes the motive suggest a young child's repeated asking about a missing family member. John Adams wrote for children's choir in some of his previous repertoire, including the oratorio El Niño, but in that piece, the children's chorus only appears at the very end of the work. On the other hand, On the Transmigration of Souls features the stark contrast between the timbres of an adult chorus and children's chorus throughout the work. The Hocket just discussed is one of those examples, and this idea is evident again on page 49 of the score. The SATB choir is singing the word light over and over again, and the children's choir can barely be heard singing love. It's a haunting section of the music, especially when juxtaposed over the chaos and panic being expressed violently in the orchestra. One of the most striking connections that Dan Blim points out in his article, Meaningful Adjacencies, Disunity in the Commemoration of 9/11 in John Adams on the Transmigration of Souls, between the music and the human experience of trauma is the duality between presence and absence. Blim explains that this memorial is particularly in service of the survivors rather than just the victims, and as a result it emphasizes the absence of those who were lost from the perspective of their relationships to the living. An example, father, lover, and daughter. These ideas are manifested in the music in a variety of ways. From early on in the piece, Adams establishes the text from the point of view of survivors, and purposely uses the vernacular as opposed to poetry or complicated language, because Adams states that when experiencing trauma or grief, the vernacular is often more accessible. He says about the missing persons posters he based a lot of the text on, quote, "What I discovered about the language of these messages was that it was invariably of the most direct and simple kind. No one stunned by the shock of a sudden loss like this had the time nor inclination to speak or write with eloquent or flowery language. Rather, one speaks in the plainest words imaginable. When we say words fail in situations like this, we mean it. So I realized that one of the greatest challenges of composing this piece would be finding a way to set the humblest of expressions like, 'He was the apple of my father's eye,' or 'She looks so full of life in that picture,'" end quote. One of the first lines of text in the work is, "We all miss you, we all love you, I'll miss you, my brother," which shows both of those artistic choices. This is a piece for the living. This section is yet another reference to the do-me motive previously discussed, and it is also consistent with the theme of referencing the missing from the perspective of the living, as the choir sings "Brother." In the beginning, the piece also emphasizes Adams' idea of the juxtaposition of presence and absence in trauma by featuring a recording of everyday sounds of a city combined with spoken words. The absence of sound being produced by the performers on stage creates an eerie feeling of missing something, reflected in the words being spoken and the open fifths later placed in the chorus and orchestra. The presence of two climaxes, representing the two towers falling, are followed by contrasting introverted music, which returns to the idea of deficiency. This juxtaposition of presence and absence are also seen in the design for the physical World Trade Center Memorial in New York City. The site is beautiful, and one of the most striking details is the fact that when standing at the edge of either fountain, one cannot see the bottom. It is a powerful symbol of the emptiness left with U.S. citizens on that fateful day. Another characteristic which shows the piece's devotion to survivors is its connection to the fact that trauma occurs most often through memories of the event, rather than the event itself. This idea is evoked through Adams' use of minimalist repetition, and effects such as the quarter-tone ensemble which give the piece a haunting, quasi-dreamlike quality. Some of the texts Adam chooses, like, "I wanted to dig him out, I know just where he is," also highlights the disorientation sometimes experienced by survivors through its confusion of tenses. Blim also discusses the concept of disunity as far as Adams' intentional avoidance of the stereotypical white, male heroic figure of 9/11. As part of the reaction to the events of that day, Americans searched for a symbol of nationalistic courage, which they found in the image of a white male first responder. Adams took steps to emphasize the diversity of both victims and heroes of 9/11 by making artistic choices such as incorporating ethnic names of survivors and using 19 names of women as part of the 82 total names mentioned, which is still a large underrepresentation despite the improvement over averages. Adams' choice of using a young boy's voice to start saying "missing," soon followed by a grown man's voice, also ties into this idea. Blim discusses the fact that in the months following the attacks, the media portrayed loss as predominantly women grieving the loss of their working husbands. This is statistically inaccurate, and by choosing a boy's voice to begin the spoken word, Adam highlights the fact that people of all ages, genders, religions, and ethnicities lost family members that day. John Adams calls Charles Ives his guardian angel for On the Transmigration of Souls, whose style Adams considered to be like a mixing board. This influence is seen very clearly in multiple ways throughout the work. For example, the piece requires recorded music to be mixed live and carefully timed in conjunction with the performers. Adams also shows his influence from Ives in his idea of using a simultaneous vertical and horizontal collage, by layering distinct sonic events on top of and next to each other. The very opening of the piece, for example, has 3 soundtracks with footsteps, sirens, and street noises. Over these tracks, Adams uses a mix of recorded voices, a boy repeating "missing," and others reading the names of the dead. This is first paired with a small instrumental force with the choir, and soon includes a full orchestra. Adams also includes references to The Unanswered Question by Charles Ives, such as by using part of the offstage trumpet solo. Adams tries to do the exact opposite of what Stravinsky and his contemporaries attempted to do, in that he creates a more unbounded sense of time and space, which suggests open-ended meditation instead of closure at the end of the piece. This idea was not only to resist closure, but to emulate the way people process trauma. The piece does not recount a narrative of 9/11, but vividly shows the experience of survivors being haunted by memories of the attacks. This concept is reinforced by Adams' use of the quarter-tone ensemble and piano, which help create a mood of distortion and disorientation. There are 2 major climaxes in On the Transmigration of Souls, which John Adams says reference the 2 towers falling. The theme of emulating trauma continues with the way Adams sets this music, as the tension builds up to each climax, but his minimalist repetition returns quickly after, similar to a survivor experiencing a flashback. The first begins with a reading of a missing persons poster, describing details about a victim, followed by the reading of a name, Carl Flickinger, which becomes distorted by the reading of the word "missing" by other spoken voices. This explodes into a brief orchestral climax, which ends sharply a few measures later.
Please call 212-799-8.
The second begins with one of the most distinct references to trauma in the piece, the statement, "I wanted to dig him out, I know just where he is." The heartbreaking tone of these sentences shows anger and affirmation. Directly after this, the sense of disorientation and suspension of time and space are highlighted, as some singers speed text up while some slow it down, and the orchestra has quickly moving string passages against dissonance in the brass and winds. The climax includes words like light, love, and sky, which seem like screams, before it comes to a sudden end and the quarter-tone ensemble returns. The second climax is much longer and more menacing, which I think reflects the shock of the actual event. Of course, the impact of the first tower was unbelievable, but the second tower falling, along with the 2 other hijacked planes that day, made us feel helpless. The length and violence of the second climax shows the extreme anger, disbelief, and hopelessness which people felt that day. One of the most striking aspects of On the Transmigration of Souls is John Adams' setting of the last words of a flight attendant on American Airlines Flight Number 11, which have become iconic words of the disaster. Her statement, "I see water and buildings," is first introduced on page 18 of the full score, and it is hauntingly menacing, as it sounds like a warning of the terrorists to come. However, one of the hardest parts of dealing with the aftermath of an attack such as 9/11 is finding the permission to move on to what becomes a new normal. Adams transforms this phrase into permission to do just that. On page 64, the phrase returns, and at this point it's more peaceful, and can almost sound like a simple description of what New York City looks like today, years after 9/11. In this different context, the phrase is unbelievably powerful. The final words spoken in the piece are, "I love you," followed by a bell ringing and a return to the opening cityscape, which provides a tranquil, spiritual ending to this emotional journey of a piece. Overall, On the Transmigration of Souls is a powerful response to the worst disaster I've experienced thus far in my lifetime. I'll never forget what that day was like and how so many people in my community lost members of their family forever. I think one of the parts of this piece which make me believe that John Adams really understands what it was like to be near New York City on 9/11 was his incorporation of the phrase, "It was a beautiful day." Although it can seem petty at first, in the weeks and months after the attacks, I found that this is the phrase people used most often when describing where they were on that morning, what they were doing, or how the attacks have impacted their lives. Beyond the obvious fact that the weather was near perfect, the phrase shows how unexpecting the American people were before this attack, and how our entire culture was transformed as a result. Even now, 13 years later, 9/11 continues to impact our foreign and domestic policies, economy, and personal lives, such as air travel. The scope of a tragedy like 9/11 was just unimaginable in 2001. I remember the shock on my teachers' faces that day and watching parents and children stare in disbelief at TV screens or across the river at the smoke which spread for miles. It shook the American people to their core that human beings were still in the 21st century capable of such evil that they would purposely murder thousands of people. It was as a result of this shattering of the U.S.'s perception of invincibility that it took years for us to decide how to respond. And the two most famous memorials, the World Trade Center Memorial at Ground Zero and On the Transmigration of Souls by John Adams, are both wonderful tributes to the victims and survivors of that day.